Hi class, welcome to the final video presentation which gives the class an overview of the information in this final unit, the U.S. Civil War. And we're going to look briefly at how, in a military sense, how the battles strategically went one way or another over time. And then we're going to look at what the Civil War meant in other ways, in building the identity of what the nation would be, its interaction with slavery, of course, its ending of it. This course often ends around June 19th, of course, which you know about now, and other topics. So here we go. The opening story is about Marcus Spiegel, and it's a good, interesting opening story for the unit because Marcus Spiegel was a German immigrant to the North, and he was a Northern Democrat, which meant, you can remember from the previous chapter, that he was not in on slavery, meaning he wasn't a slave owner or living in the South who saw it as a fundamental part of his life. But as a Northern Democrat, he wanted to continue the compromise where slavery and freedom coexist in the United States for different people. So he eventually joins the war for the Union and fights. And what happens is, as his unit goes further south, as the war progresses, he changes his mind. And he writes letters back home saying, you know what, slavery has to end. It's really bad. Again, I'm paraphrasing him. And you can read that letter home in the opening story. And then he dies in battle. So a real snapshot of one person's journey that kind of mirrors the North, as part of the North, as they're moving forward. All right. So first things first, to set out some basic historical facts that I wouldn't expect everyone to know. You don't do this for a living, or most people don't. And that is to remember that the Union had slave states on their side. So the lowest color here, blue, they're the ones who secede from the Union once Lincoln's victory seems to be sure. Notice the important four states of them, Virginia, the most important. They have not seceded once the fighting has begun in Fort Sumter down in South Carolina. It's only after that they were hoping there would be a resolution without going to war. And now it seems that's not the case. So if there's going to be war, they'll go with the South, the Confederate States of America. And you can see Missouri, Kentucky, and it's not showing you on this map part of Virginia, which we now call West Virginia. They will not join the Confederacy because they want to stay in the Union, they want a resolution, and they want a continuance of the compromise, free and slave. And then up in Maryland and Delaware, those areas might have joined the Confederacy, but they're not going to have a chance to. Lincoln will mobilize his forces to take over those areas to make sure they don't. So, all right, so it can't be a war to end slavery at the very beginning, can it? Because there are slave states in the North. And so for the Confederate states, they've lost their liberty. The North has changed their mind on the compromise, and so they're out. And then we've always had the right to do this, they would say. For the northern states, then, the argument would be then, we are only good as a unit, and you don't get to leave just because you want to. We have something more important at stake, the Union. And so they fight to bring them back to the Union. And then, as you will see over this unit, that will transition for the North towards ending slavery. Now, in hindsight, the South will have a very difficult time winning this war, as you can see by all the ways we can check production and military capabilities and people, other than cotton down in the bottom right. the North dwarfs the South in productive capability. Now, that cotton down on the bottom right can come into play if Great Britain decides to continue to trade with the Confederacy, and then they will use that cotton to purchase, military goods. So that's one way out for the South to win this war. And second, perhaps you never thought of this, but they did. They don't have to win the war. They just have to not lose it. They'll be fighting a defensive war, and as long as they continue, one day the Union will give up, right? And that's a strategy of defending military forces who might have inferior numbers, but are fighting on home fronts, and that is one of the tactics they can use. So if you're semi-familiar with the American war in Vietnam, that has some complications, of course, because there's many moving parts. But for some of the Viet Cong who are in South Vietnam, which they consider their territory, they felt that one day the occupying forces, the imperialist forces, it's just going to get too expensive and they'll go home. And that's kind of how the South was hoping. So cotton could save them because it could buy things. And if we fight a defensive war, we don't have to win, just not lose. Right, Jefferson Davis on the left as the Confederate president, Lincoln on the right. And so the North's first real military move is to surround the South and blockade it so it can't trade, right? So it knows exactly what cotton diplomacy is, what the South is trying to do, and it seeks to do it. This blockade will remain in effect for the duration of the war. And unlike this Anaconda, it was called the Anaconda Plan, there are, you can't line up a ship every 6 feet, right? There has to be space between them. And some southern trading ships get through. But the blockade is successful enough that it reduces trade to a bare minimum. If for some reason you ever do see Gone with the Wind, which I'd like to point out is the highest grossing film of all time adjusted for inflation. Sorry, Mad Max or Tom Cruise or Top Gun, that was it. Or Spider-Man 2 or something, right? When you adjust for inflation, Gone with the Wind is the biggest. So anyway, back to that. If you do see a movie, one of the characters, the main character of 2, Rhett Butler, that's what he does, is he runs the blockade with his ships and can earn a lot of money that way. So the South is isolated during the war, but again, it's defending. And it turns out that defending right near Washington, D.C. and Richmond, we call it the Virginia Corridor, for a few years, the North keeps attacking there mostly. And the South is able to defend it. So for this class, we won't go into the details of the battle like we do some in the other class, but I want you to see that, don't forget the South. You remember the compromise way back in Hamilton's day, that the capital would be moved to the South, and it's in the South, and so it's exposed to potential conquest by Confederate armies. And so Lincoln and his generals seek to give it space and move on to Richmond. And so what you'll see is in the blue circles, they'll tend to march towards that center red circle near Manassas by a creek or a river called Bull Run. And that's where, this area is where a lot of the first main battles do occur. And if you look up at Johnston, upper left corner, every time the blue, in this map it's called McDowell, moves towards, in this map called Beauregard near Manassas, Johnston out there in the Shenandoah Valley can hear about it and is able to rush to Beauregard's aid, or who's ever managing it there. And so they're able to use their smaller forces effectively to fight the Union soldiers. So anyway, so the not necessary for the test to know the details, but in the morning, the Union forces are coming towards the Manassas Junction. the Confederate forces are able to meet them at, as you can see, Matthews Hill, pull back to Henry House Hill. At Henry House Hill, they're able to dig in even further, and they are able to be victorious, and they send the Union running. So this is the first main battle of the Civil War, and some things are learned from it. One, all the people who went to go see the war and bring picnics and observe this entertainment went fleeing too. This was not going to be a pretty war for spectators. Two, managing all these men now, these people, to be fair, because there are more than men there, it's complicated. Trains, schedules, marchings, supplies, discipline, this is all going to be very important, more than they thought. So it's going to be a longer war, they're starting to realize. If you look at the map here, the Henry House is just behind the blue line. An interesting side story is that's the Henry House after the battle, and there was an 80-year-old plus invalid woman. She was in that house on the second floor, and she couldn't get out, and so she was struck by in this case it was a Union cannon fire, because they thought there was fire coming from the house, so they took it out. She died there, so one of the first known civilian casualties of the war as well. So that's in summer of 61. In summer of 62, there is a second battle in the same general area for the same reason. They want to be able to gain control of the railroad junctions, because movement of troops and supplies is now just as important as the battle. Well, they lead to the success or defeat of the battle. So this time it's not as bad as a Union defeat, but the Union defeat is exactly what happened. And again, not knowing to need the details, here we see, if you look to the lower right, you can see Henry House Hill and all that. So this battle is fought fairly closely to it. This time, Stonewall Jackson's troops are behind an unfinished railroad space, which gives them the defense. Which brings me to my next point: is what's starting to become apparent in the Civil War is that defense, if it's not caught unawares, has the advantage. And so this war will be much more deadly because the defensive group has more power, more capability. And so to overcome that, the attacking force would need to send in very large amounts of men to remove them or destabilize them. And that would require a lot of casualties by the attacking group, kind of like World War I down the road. So that's something that starts to emerge here. And in the second battle, once again, the Confederate forces are victorious. So it's becoming a very deadly battle. The defense has the advantage, and around Virginia, at least just the few battles we're looking at, the Union forces cannot seem to dislodge them. And so on to Antietam, the bloodiest battle of the war, that's of one battle. We just see the costs beginning to escalate. And so we won't go through the details. I'm just giving you some highlights, but here now the Union forces have decided they're going to have to attack with higher casualties for themselves and their opponents. That a war of attrition, of a lot of men and people dying, is actually what's going to be needed to defeat the South. It can't be done in a daintily swift manner. And so there's high casualties around the cornfield, as it's known, and then along the Bloody Lane, which is right here. I'll give you an example of what it looked like after. And then the third phase, the Union's doing very well, but once again, the Confederate forces are able to win the day, and it's more of a stalemate at this point, although we'll call it stalemate, that's good enough. And so in 1862, we're beginning to see the realization by the leaders that something needs to be done. And no, there's nothing wrong with your screen. The initial print is cracked. And so, as we're going to see after this battle, Lincoln feels comfortable to start mobilizing the rhetoric of the revolution, of the Civil War towards slavery, ending slavery. But it's also for he's fighting a propaganda war, as we're going to see. He's trying to win the war in many ways. So the war's being very destructive, and we'll come back to the slavery issue here in a second. So that's 1861 and 1862 done just in 3 battles that are representative of the center where the bulk of the fighting forces were. In 1863, the tide turns. 2 major battles pretty close to each other, although the first one's been going on for a while. The Union wins, and they're very important, as we'll see here in a second. So the first is Vicksburg. Vicksburg is on the Mississippi River, and it is a fort that has been, since the Civil War started, and of course before, on the Mississippi River, where there's this long bend in the river. And it takes ships a long time to get by the fort because the river isn't going straight, right? It's winding. And so this has allowed the Confederacy to keep the Union from controlling the Mississippi River from up, near Illinois all the way down to the ocean. And it's hard to defeat a fort like this, but over time it is possible. If you can surround them and starve them out, they will eventually have to give up. And that's what happened to Vicksburg in 1863. And so the Union becomes eventually victorious at Vicksburg. You can't attack it from the water. You can, but you're going to lose, expensive, precious boats. So you keep some boats on the water to not allow them to escape. And you can kind of see that's what's going on in the painting. You can see 2 boats in each direction on the bend. And then you surround it and semi-attack it over time by land until they are starved out. So it's just another example of our map of that. So what that effectively does, if you were to imagine the United States on a map, is it cuts the Confederacy into 2 parts that can't cooperate. One on the east side of the Mississippi, the larger units, but now some units are on the west side of it and can't prosecute their war as well. Very soon after this, the Confederacy moves into the north a bit into Pennsylvania and is defeated, as you probably know, at Gettysburg with the famous slaughtering of some of the most important or valuable Confederate soldiers for their army, and that was a lot of their cavalry perished in Pickett's charge. So and why does Lee go? Dr. Chambers, didn't you say that they just had to fight a defensive war and not lose it? That's correct. By 63, the high command of the Confederacy has concluded that that's not true anymore. They're going to lose the war in the long run because they're starting to feel the squeeze of material, and production. And so they're starting to say, I think we need to gamble, because if we can defeat the Union forces in the north, then the Union population will put pressure on their government to sue for peace. And that was a possibility, as you're going to see. The Democratic Party's platform in the 1864 election was to end the war and allow the South to leave, right? Now, you can't use that today as some sort of if you want to dump on your friends who are Democrats. And of course, this goes both ways. You can't use events from the 1860s and attach them to modern-day parties, by the way. They're not the same thing at all. So they've been rebranded numerous times since and aren't the same animal. So, but battle-wise, we'll come back to the battles after 1863, but after 63, in these 2 battles, it's very clear what direction barring some sort of divine intervention or catastrophe or plague, the Union's going to win the war. So there's a section in the unit that you should look at and know. African Americans in the Civil War. In the North, African Americans who were interested in being soldiers were turned away by the Army. And in the city of New York and some of the bigger cities, there was fear by non-African Americans that African Americans would pose a problem in their city. Yeah, I know, it has a long history. And, by the way, the Union and the Confederacy both turn to the draft. They compel people to go fight in the wars. It's not a volunteer thing, just like the Revolutionary War. The Revolutionary War had a draft, right? So if your friends, or the guy driving down the street with his bumper sticker, has this idea of the Revolutionary War, and that's when the Minutemen got up and fought for their country. That is true. That did happen, especially at the beginning of the Revolutionary War. But it was under a year. And I know that's another topic, but they start offering a lot of money and land, right? That land for someone in 1776 who doesn't have it is the ultimate lottery ticket. And still that wasn't enough. So they resort to the draft instead of offering you payment for your service. Same in the Civil War. In the North, they will turn to the draft and compel you by lottery to go fight in the war. In the South, they've been doing this from very early on. After the first wave of volunteers, they need a draft system. And what's kind of interesting, and I'll get back to this slide in a second, but I'm on a roll here, is in the South, the legislatures, right, political power is not evenly shared. If you go and look on the North or the South Congresses, they're not full of blacksmiths and farmers and school teachers, right? They are full, but not exclusively, but full of more wealthier groups. And in the South, slave owners, large slave owners, are the wealthiest group, and they dominate. So the war is being fought for them to maintain this system that's enriching them. And at any rate, when it comes to the draft, they passed a law that for every 20 slaves a unit controls, one man is exempt from the draft. And so if you were on a plantation that was pretty large for its day and had 44 slaves, then 2 of the men in the slave-owning family could not be drafted. And you can imagine if you owned 0 slaves, that bet you could be. And so there was a little bit eventually consciousness of non-slave owners that they were fighting a slave owners war, but they still bought into it quite a bit. To be fair, the large slave owners that I mentioned, their exemptions, a lot of them were officers in the Army. So interestingly, combined with being in the Army as an officer and then not being drafted, some of them of the family, there were very few wealthy Southerners, slave owners, who ended up in the rank and file and died. So their death rates in the Civil War were lower than for commoners. Okay, so back to the New York City riots. They are race riots and anti-draft riots at the same time. So, in the Civil War, in the Revolutionary War, 2 big wars so far, the draft has played a significant role, and often people will fight back. So, for African Americans in 1863, the North decides that they can use them in the Army as long as they're segregated. And so the book will go through the differences of pay and conditions that they endured. But eventually, African Americans will represent 10% of the Northern armed forces. That's pretty significant because they are not 10% of the population, that's for sure. They knew, as did everyone, that if they got caught or surrendered in battle, they would be enslaved or perhaps just shot. on the spot. Now in the South, of course, there are almost 4 million African American slaves, let alone more African Americans who are free in the cities. So these were mobilized for the war effort. If the army told a slave owner, we need 20 slaves to go do this, that, and the other, they were mobilized, but not as soldiers, even after 63. So the North doing similar things with free people, not making them soldiers, but in 63 they did. For the South, they'd wait till the very, very end, and by that point, it's too late. And it's, of course, pretty obvious why they feared it. Arming the slaves, they could turn the guns, right? Right, another interesting section is this idea of, will the Civil War become the moment in which kind of a new definition of liberty and what America is takes place. So when you're looking at this section, I just want you to, I'm just kind of highlighting it for you and not lecturing on it for this presentation, but I want you to notice that a lot of different people are trying to decide what American liberty is going to be. And in the middle of this is the Gettysburg Address, right? So if you see the Gettysburg Address, that is exactly what it's in the middle of, is trying to say, look, this is what the United States is going to be like when it's over. And you can see that reconstructions are really beginning early on in the war of re-establishing what liberty, who has it, does race play a role or not. That's what's going on. Now, on both sides, you'll find conflict during the war. In the North, those who opposed the war were called Copperheads, which is a poisonous snake in North America. The majority who supported the war thought that these groups, their anti-war position was, I know, wait for it, you'll probably hear this in your lifetime at some point, is not patriotic, it's ruining the war effort, you don't have a right to think this way, if you don't like it, leave, so on and so forth. And the Democratic platform represents this group that wanted the war to end. In the South, there were some who, the opposite of the Democrats in 64, wanted to go back to be part of the Union. And they were a much smaller minority than the Northern Democrats were in 1864. Already mentioned the 20 slave exemption in the draft, the poor man's fight and a rich man's war. The final bullet point reminds us that, especially in the South, the people's resources, the farm's resources, their cattle, their metal, their jewelry, all sorts of items are being used to fight the war. And so the resources in the Confederacy, from food to animals to pull wagons to anything, is starting to dwindle quickly by 1864. So the end is in sight, though it's not there yet. Here's the elections of 1864. As you can see, most vote Republican. Notice Kentucky, one of the 3 slave-owning border states, goes with the McClellan group, who wants to end the war. So, all right, battles, ending the war. So we've been to 63, now we go to 64. On the left, by the way, you can see the Mississippi River and Vicksburg being defeated in 63. Now, going from Kentucky and Tennessee through Georgia to the sea, this is pretty famous as well. It does show up in Gone with the Wind. So when this is completed by 64, then the South, which I've already told you is becoming quite depleted, is now cut into thirds. It's strongly occupied, not all parts of course, and it's been divided up. So that only leaves our final wave in 1865. There is this, 64, excuse me. At this time, the Confederacy tries to attack to see again if they can get the North to capitulate and sue for peace. Over the next few months, that does not happen, and down at the bottom left, number 8, in spring 65, the war is over. Now looking forward, but we're at the end of this class, then the dominant winning group, along with the groups in the South, have to start deciding, all right, how are we going to come back together? And the 13th Amendment, as you may know, ends slavery. The 14th Amendment is supposed to create civil rights equality for all people. It won't at this time. It will for many, but not for all. And then in the 1960s, laws passed that's supposed to kind of help that, and you could argue today it did or didn't extend it or make it further. That's for another class. And then the 15th Amendment, a right to vote, is supposed to be allowing all adult males to vote regardless of race, but it doesn't end up doing that. Now you can do all this, by the way. This is radical change for the United States of America, extending civil rights and voting rights to African Americans too. Well, this is all done without representation from most of the South, so you can get stuff done like that. Will they resolve the systemic inequalities? Well, there's a big group who is interested in it, but unfortunately for racial equality, it will not end up happening in most places moving forward. And of course, that's something you as an American inherit today, whether you think racial equality has been strongly addressed or not. It really is immaterial. You should always, meaning that what you think is not necessarily what all Americans think and understand. So listening to each other is always a great move there. So, all right. So this ends the Civil War, and the North has opened up a spot where liberty may be redefined in a new radical way without racial limitations. And in the beginning of the next class, you'll see that for the most part, and in most ways, that will be reclosed down. It's been a great semester. I really, really hope that your minds have been open to understand the United States in new, complicated, nuanced, and now evidenced ways. You have good evidence for what you think now. And I think that's one of the greatest things college can do for us. You don't all have to think the same, but you can understand the United States in a more sophisticated way. That's more true in that it has more evidence to back up how you see it. All right.